to start up. We're still just before 2. And there it goes. Okay. Whenever you like, Alice.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to the second day of WEIS. And we're up for an absolute treasure amount of presentations this afternoon. Starting off, we have Ben Collier, who will be presenting the paper Crime is Often Boring. As with yesterday, please direct your questions to the chat. We'll give Ben a maximum of 12 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for a couple of minutes of questions, and then we'll have some further opportunities for questions after the 3 speakers. So thanks, Ben. Take it away.
Yep. Sorry, just getting screen sharing working. Hang on. Sorry, I'll need to leave and rejoin. I'll be back in 1 minute. Unmute and share screen. There we go, that's working now. Apologies. So, if that's working. Hi, so my name is Ben Collier. I'm here today to talk about our paper, Cybercrime is Often Boring, Maintaining the Infrastructures of Cybercrime Economies, aka the boring paper, aka Das Kapital for system administrators. So to kick things off, I'd like to really thank my co-authors, Richard Clayton, Alice Hutchings, and Daniel Thomas, from variously. I'm from the University of Edinburgh, but also from the University of Cambridge Cybercrime Centre, and Daniel's from Strathclyde University. I'd also like to thank our excellent reviewers who were extremely kind to this paper, and also to the interviewees we interviewed for the project. So to kick things off with a bit of context, I'm going to start with a kind of history of cybercrime communities and how academics have understood them. So we can imagine this is sort of starting in the 1980s, where we see this idea of the hacker as the sort of the lone radical, the sort of super user who's incredibly highly skilled at technology, often as a sort of like libertarian or techno-libertarian, anti-authoritarian sort of aesthetic and set of ethics and codes and practices, and is this sort of like charismatic lone deviant who commits sort of very high harm but low incidence crime. Then we kind of move on to this sort of progresses. We realize that hackers and sort of cybercrime is not about these sort of individual lone actors. It's actually organized around communities. So this is where we bring in this idea of the sort of elites versus script kiddies, this sort of tool sharing community where you've got this small central core of sort of very highly skilled actors, again, the original sort of hackers, who then create tools that are used by others, people who aren't as technically skilled. So it reduces the skill barrier. And allows this sort of crime to scale up. So a much wider range of people are able to use these tools. But then, so this progresses even further, and we see this idea of sort of the industrialization of cybercrime. So the move to cybercrime as a service. So this happens because these tools, these sort of cybercrime tools that people use still require a fair bit of nous to get to actually work in practice and to get to work as part of a criminal enterprise. And so what people begin to do is build these infrastructures. So it's not just a tool, but it's a sort of full service infrastructure so that people who want to use them don't really have to have any technical ability at all. And the kind of people running these infrastructures take care of all the kind of customer service, all this kind of thing. They just sort of plug into it. And so as we can see this economy scaling up, we're progressively transitioning from a sort of low volume but high harm crime to a volume crime problem, where you've got very, very large instance, but potentially low harm for each individual act. There we go. So obviously, this now relies on infrastructure, and this is something that really interested us. So it's this infrastructure that enables the sort of true scaling up of cybercrime. But from sort of Susan Lee Starr's work on infrastructure, which we drawn in the paper, we realized that actually this infrastructure needs an enormous amount of invisible supportive labor to work, as all infrastructures do. If you imagine the sort of electrical grid in a city or the water grid in a city, this doesn't just work on its own. It requires huge amounts of invisible labor, maintenance work, sort of customer support, all this different stuff. But at the heart of a lot of these cybercrime communities is a subculture that's still based on this idea of this sort of mythic lone hacker that's high skilled, that doesn't look a lot like this sort of maintenance and invisible work. So we were really interested in kind of how does the sort of image of the hacker square with the actual work that's now involved in these sort of infrastructural cybercrime economies. So in terms of our methods, this was initially started as an interview project with sort of these cybercrime support workers, people working in these sort of cybercrime as a service businesses. But we also brought in data science approaches. So we scraped chat channels, used data from social media, and looked at cybercrime forums. And we're wanting to kind of explore the nature and experience of this sort of supportive work in these illicit economies. So in the paper, we draw 8 core characteristics of this supportive work, but I'm going to focus on 3 here. It's quite a long paper, but if you want to read about the other ones, feel free to read those. But I'll focus on kind of 3 core characteristics for the purpose of this presentation. So the first characteristic we found is that this work is largely built on stability. So these infrastructures to work as infrastructures, things that people can kind of build businesses around, build new stuff on top of, they need to be stable. The customers for these services are not patient and are extremely wary of scams. So if your botnet service, for example, or your DDoS service, for example, goes down for a week when you're on holiday, your customers, who often pay through a subscription model, will get extremely angry, assume you've scammed them out of a bunch of money, and will move to another service pretty quickly. And that kind of reputation loss can often be very crippling for a business. What this means is to maintain this uptime requires huge amounts of supportive labor and being sort of on call. So this is very different. This generates this huge amount of supportive work that's very different from the kind of creative breaking, high-skilled technical work that's often associated with cybercrime and often associated with hacking. It's very different. It's largely practices of system administration and customer support, and often things like community management. Additionally, you're facing constant disruption as well from intermediaries, so hosting companies and the like, banning you, so you've got to set your service up again, the police taking down your stuff, and also from your own incompetence. So a lot of the people who we interviewed had a sort of vague idea of how things worked, but weren't really skilled enough to automate things with any level of skill. Of course, there are exceptions where people are able to automate this kind of work, but a lot of these businesses actually lack the technical skill to automate it. And it makes for a really long on-call week. I remember reading one fantastic exchange where one of these people, a server administrator, was on holiday and suddenly realized his botnet had gone down, and then desperately was trying to scan for new bots over his hotel Wi-Fi with somewhat hilarious results. So the second sort of set of findings we found were around the sort of skill involved this work and the kinds of cultural capital associated with it. So this is very much sort of like maintenance and sort of community administration and customer support work. And it doesn't attract a great deal of social capital within cybercrime subculture. So you'll see a lot of people talking about, this isn't real hacking, this isn't real technical work, these people are just kids, they don't really know what they're doing, this kind of stuff. And this shows that actually to a lot of people involved, not to everyone, but to a lot of people involved in these communities, the kind of hacker ethic and the aesthetics of hacking and this sort of almost mythic idea of the hacker is still really important to the social status within these communities. And this work doesn't attract a great deal of cultural capital. There's no real sense that people are progressing in skill when they're doing this work, and there's no real chance for them to use the sort of technical creativity that often attracted them into these subcultures. It's also pretty low paid, and what we found was that the sort of skills that you develop, they're essentially administration skills. They don't require a deep understanding of the technology that you're using, so often people will be running or mounting stuff on servers that they don't really understand how it works. They know if they configure it and play around with it in a certain way, they can get it to just about remain stable, but often they don't really understand why what they're doing is producing that result. What this all ties back to, and this was kind of one of the big findings for us, was people kept bringing this up, was that this idea of deep, deep boredom. The routines of this work, the actual lived experience of doing this work was for these people deeply, deeply tedious. Initially, this sort of boring rote nature of it was a bonus. Like a lot of these people were used to playing sort of video games where you need to grind out credits, grind out sort of like experience points and stuff. And this was just another one of these sorts of activities where you could kind of sit around, blaze a joint, play computer games, and also make some money on the side. But it becomes progressively less satisfying for people over the time and fundamentally changes the experience for them of being in this world. And it's a lot of these people were getting really sad and depressed and disillusioned when the sort of exciting frontiers of what they thought was like this hacker ethic turn out to be just sort of like boring routine office work. So what does this kind of tell us for understanding cybercrime communities? So within sort of mid-century criminology, the middle of the last century, there was this dominant idea of the kind of subcultural model of crime. This idea that, in mainstream society, when, these conventional ways of making money or attaining social status are blocked, for which they are for large segments of the population, not everyone could just become rich overnight, not everyone could attain social status, that when these become blocked, small groups of people will try and attain them through other means, illicit means, often becoming attracted to subcultures, which have alternative means of making money, alternative ways of getting social status based on different social norms. But what we've found is that when the economies attached to these illicit subcultures reach these sort of advanced stages of development, industrialization, they begin to reproduce these same conditions of labor alienation in the sort of Marxist sense as the regular economy. And we found that looking at all these different phenomena, this isn't just boredom. This is like a deep, what sociologists call anomie. It's a deep dissatisfaction with and disidentification with these norms that socially bind people. And it has it's this corrosive weakening effect on the social bonds at the center of this subculture. And the clash between the actual material conditions of this work and the sort of core values that animate the subculture means that people are burning out. A lot of the people we spoke to were either on the verge of or had recently burned out of doing this work, these sort of 80 hours of sort of boring administration work every week. And that caused them to desist, to sort of say, well, I'm giving this up. This isn't really for me. Obviously, and kind of this is something that people pointed out to us about this work, this only really applies to the kind of subcultural cybercrime. So for example, if you get into this knowing it's going to be an office job, knowing it's going to be boring, but you want something to pay the bills, then potentially this kind of burnout isn't as much of an issue. But we found that for people who got into this thinking, no, I want to be part of the hacker subculture, this was like a real issue for them. So what does this mean in terms of policy? I think one of the things we found is that the police and big businesses, when you see these big breaches, often imply for fairly obvious reasons, that this is a really high skilled hack. These are dangerous, exciting people. They stole loads and loads of money. And it tends to sort of glamorize this work, which is actually more likely, tedious office jobs dependent on sort of using well-worn exploits or services. And we think that this might actually be quite counterproductive, because if where this is a sort of subcultural phenomenon, if people are getting involved because they believe this is going to be quite exciting and quite interesting, and you've got this idea of the cool hacker and all that sort of thing, then buttressing that and sort of like, is actually counterproductive. And perhaps we should be playing up the sort of boring and facile elements of this work. Additionally, other people have pointed out to us that actually a lot of other volume harm that we're interested in relies on this kind of supportive maintenance work. So for example, mass online harassment, kind of far right agitating online and online disinformation, these also rely on vast amounts of maintenance, getting around bans, getting around sort of administration.
That was the 12-minute timer, by the way.
Cool. I'll just do the last sentence and then that'll be me. So the last thing we're going to say is that, let's go on alarm. So maybe whack-a-mole is potentially a bit more useful than we thought, because actually it's contributing to these people burning out and potentially desisting. And that's me.
Wonderful. So let's have a look, and please put your questions in the chat. We have Stephen Bonner has quoted one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut. Another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think This is one of the interesting things. So for my PhD research a few years ago, I looked at the Tor community, and kind of that's an example of where maintenance work is sustainable, and like people do sustain it. This kind of like this sometimes fairly boring work of running a Tor relay, for example. And in that case, I think it's because there is a really strong belief system there, right? There's a strong belief in kind of like privacy and supporting the community and this kind of thing. And that kind of binds people together and keeps them involved in like kind of doing this maintenance work on the Tor network. But for, oh, sorry, I can see that there for this, there's potentially not that core animating value. For the whack-a-mole question, I guess, so this is the thing where, sorry, yeah, that's, I guess, industry jargon. So one of the main ways people try and take down these services is by sort of knocking out the hosting. So basically taking down takedowns. But it's often pretty easy for people to just set them back up again. So you just get a different hosting company and then set it up there. And we call this whack-a-mole because you're sort of hitting it in one place and it just pops up again in another place, hit it there, pops up again in another place. And we usually think this is quite useless because, you know, you take it down, it just comes right back. But actually, it's really, really infuriating for these low-skilled people to kind of like to keep having to set up the same server over and over and over and over again, and potentially contribute to burnout.
I see we have quite a few questions coming through. It is now time for the second talk. So please keep your questions coming and we'll be able to revisit this discussion at the end of the session. So we next have Qasim Lone, who are talking about saving the internet, explaining the adoption of source address validation by internet service providers.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, my name is Qasim Lone, and welcome to my talk. I'm really honored to present on WEIS Consortium. This is my first time, so hopefully more to come. Today, I'm going to explain my work on saving the internet, explaining the adoption of source address validation by internet service provider. This work was jointly done with the researchers from Delft University of Technology and University of Grenoble Alps. So let's begin. I would like to start with some of the biggest challenges faced by network operators. In a recent survey in
Qasim, do you have slides to show here?
You're not
in a black screen.
Oh, really? Let me see.
Make sure that your slides are sort of in the center of your monitor before you share them, not going off the edge. That's better.
Oh, we can see that, yes.
Okay. All right. So you can see my slides now?
That's all good.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to begin with some of the challenges the network operators face. In one of the meetups in RIPE, they usually conduct a survey at the end. And in 2019, a survey by RIPE, more than 4,000 operators identified distributed denial of service attack as their most significant security challenge. So what is a distributed denial of service attack, and how does an attacker use this attack? The core or the heart of DDoS attack is basically an attacker using a forged IP address. So what it does, it sends or emits packets from compromised machines, and the packet it sets the source IP address as the target or the victim's IP address, and it sends the packet to reflectors. In the example over here, it sends to OpenDNS resolver. The resolver then sends the traffic or redirects the traffic to the victim. And in most cases, this traffic is amplified. That means the response is way larger than the request. And what it does is basically it makes the victim machine or network inaccessible to the internet, or they cannot send or receive any more traffic. So how can we mitigate this kind of attack? Well, the simplest answer is if we can somehow disable the ability of the attacker to spoof the IP packets, we can mitigate distributed denial of service attack for at least using reflectors and amplification. Well, this is exactly what the RFC says, BCP38 and BCP84, with the idea of using ingress filtering as a solution. The general idea is very simple, which means that the source IP address leaving a network, the network operator should check against the set of allowed IP addresses, and a packet which has an invalid source address, it should be discarded by the operators. So if it is this simple of a methodology, why do network operators not filter spoofed IP packets or deploy source address validation in the network? There could be multiple reasons for this, but we identified 4 key factors which are basically due to misaligned incentives. The first one is the cost of adoption. There is some hardware requirements, but more significantly, the knowledge and engineering time needed to deploy source address validation is one of the key factors. The other part is the externality. That is the network operators that deploy source address validation in their network. They bear the cost of adoption, but the benefits would not, or in most cases might not go to them because they are protecting the other victims. That is, attackers cannot use their network to deploy these kind of attacks, but they can still get attacked. So there is an issue of motivation over here. The third factor which we identified in our paper was information asymmetry. It is often not visible to customers and other providers that which networks have deployed source address validation or which are compliant and which are not compliant. And what that means also is that it does not generate any sort of reputation benefit for these, or vice versa. So negative reputation also is not there for people who are deploying it. So again, there is less of a motivation, and there is time and cost for the adoption of source address validation. And the final factor that we think is more important of why they are not deploying source address validation is weakest link. What that means is that unless and until all the operators in the world deploy source address validation, the attack is still feasible. Of course, if more and more operators are deploying source address validation, the attack vector gets less and less. But still, even handful of non-compliant networks means that the attack is feasible. The other part is that it is very difficult, or I think impossible, to trace back the attack to the offending network. So to estimate the impact of this misaligned incentives on the absence of source address validation, we tried to build, or we built a causal model and ran a linear regression on it. We combined 2 different or independent data sets with observations for absence of source address validation in them. In total, we found absence of source address validation for certain prefixes in 250 ISPs from a set of 334 ISPs in 61 countries. Next, our response variable was the proportion of IP space that allows spoofing, and we use 4 causal factors, which are network complexity, security efforts of these ISPs, the characteristics of ISPs, and institutional environment. A bit more detail on this is in this slide. So for network complexity, for instance, we looked at the advertised IP space, the number of prefixes announced by these ISPs, and the stability of these prefixes. For security effort, we looked at the spam bots. We also looked at the number of amplifiers in their network, which is kind of like a hygiene factor for their networks. We also looked at whether they are signing their BGP prefixes with RPKI or not. In ISP characteristics, we looked at the number of subscribers, the subscription prices, the revenue of these ISPs. In the institutional factors, we looked at the ICT development index. It's basically an index per country, which says how much ICT development is in those countries. And we also looked if the ISPs are signatory of manners. So Manners is an initiative which basically suggests ISPs to deploy certain routing security norms. And one of the requirement is to be compliant with source address validation. So some key takeaways from our causal model are that we found larger ISPs to be more non-compliant or are less likely to be compliant. Similarly, the ISPs with more number of prefixes were also more likely to be non-compliant. We found no effect on the AS stability. In the security effort, we find that our ISPs that were signing their prefixes with RPKI are also more likely to be more compliant. The ISPs which have more amplifiers are less likely to be compliant or have more non-compliant IP space. We did not find any effect with spam bots. In the characteristics, we did not find subscription prices or revenue having any effect on the non-compliant IP space. In the institutional factor, we did find ISPs that were operating in countries with higher ICT development to be more compliant or more likely to be compliant. So to wrap up, we gave some recommendations on how to move forward. One of them is reducing the cost of adoption. As I said, the more significant challenge is basically the knowledge on how to perform this in their network. So we explained that community-driven educational programs should be offered, then some open source, easy to use tool to configure source address validation, to reduce information asymmetry. There should be a way or ability for people to test their network and post results on social media or public platform, kind of naming and shaming. Then we propose that maybe government can do some action. So at least they could say that the governmental contracted networks should be should provide source address validation. There is also some kind of some major players that can help getting this adopted for more networks. For instance, there are tier 1, tier 2 networks which give which have peering agreements with the ISPs, and they could make sure that the stub ASs or the ISPs that can deploy source address validation should be compliant. Then we propose some community action initiatives like Manners should be encouraged more. And then national certs and regional internet registries can also use their position of power and then improve the compliance in their country and region of operation. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions in the chat. So the first one is from Stephen Bonner. He asks, could it be that the larger ISPs are the older ones and may have the infrastructure and processes that predate source address validation development and hence have higher cost than smaller greenfield organizations?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I think it could be a possibility. Also, we are now doing like a follow-up of this study, and we are sending notifications to ISPs that are non-compliant through various channels. And one interesting thing that we found was like one ISP saying initially that no, we are fully compliant. And then they said, oh, we actually had a new hardware or we changed routers in some of in our infrastructure. And basically we forgot to do the filtering on those routers. And then they sent us another email that can we check it again? And then we didn't see that we saw that they were compliant again. So there are like multiple factors at play here, and one of them could be that they have older infrastructure which is non-compliant, or they have actually a newer infrastructure and they did not actually have the correct filtering in those routers, or the configuration might have not happened yet. So yes, that is definitely a possibility.
Okay, now I think we have time for one more question before we move into the next paper. So Daniel Thomas asks, how did you test whether source address validation was implemented? The CADA spoofer probe data set.
So
he asks, yeah.
Yes, so we did use CADA spoofer dataset, and we used another method. I think that was in a Usenix paper before us, using open resolvers. I think the paper is Exit from Hell. So they are the ones who introduced that methodology, but we wrote our own scanner and we collected data using that dataset. So they were the two datasets that we used to collect information about the ISPs that are not compliant.
Okay, wonderful. So we have some more questions, but we'll get back to these in the discussion at the end. So it's now time for our next speaker, and we have Vincent Lefrère, sorry if I've mispronounced it, talking about the impact of GDPR on content providers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, can everybody see my slides?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you to attend to this conference and this session. I'm very happy to be here. I will present you a joint work on the impact of GDPR on content provider. This study is a part of a rapidly increasing subgenre of GDPR studies. What I'm going to present to you, it's ongoing work, and more precisely, it's a moving target, meaning that we're still collecting and cleaning the data. We still are waiting for key variables. So what I will present to you, it's preliminary and might change a little. So as I'm sure you are all aware of, the new, or at least the recent general data protections that have been put in place in May 2018 was designed to protect you citizen and give back some control to you user. From an academic point of view, this set of rules is interesting not only from a privacy perspective, but from the standpoint of experimental design, as it creates the condition for a natural experiment. However, the condition here for the perfect natural experiment analysis between treatment and control is not that simple, because the GDPR intend to apply to every EU organizations, but also every EU citizen, even outside Europe. So for example, US websites have to comply. And another key characteristic here is the fact that not only US website or US company have to comply to the GDPR in the case of US citizens, but also in the most case, organization need to obtain the explicit consent prior to collecting and processing individual data. This new set of rules generate a huge amount of complaint, especially from the industry. For example, one of the claims of the industry is that the GDPR implementation will decrease the amount of data available and therefore decrease the revenue generated through advertising, as underlined by this report of Deloitte 2013 that claimed that the ROI that business will expect to receive from other channels will decrease by 27%. This clear link that the industry make between access to the data and income will create a reduction or free and high quality content from their perspective. Fortunately, not only the GDPR has interest in in this impact, but also academic. However, still limited evidence on the GDPR effect on downstream economic variable. In particular, unknown impact on the profitability of ad-supported content provider and the ability to keep providing free and quality online content. But we want to study this, and we want to see if in fact it's happening. So we study whether and how domain in the EU and in the US reacted to GDPR, and how it's affected the content of the new content and the quality of the new content those domain produce. We use a natural field experiment approach, like I say in the introductions. So we use a definitive approach, comparing EU domain versus US domain before and after the GDPR, even if we know that this definitive is problematic, and it will be one of the key characteristics that we will investigate on the future. But we still believe, like other academic, that this approach still show some evidence. So in this presentation, we focus only on domain categories such as news and media, which are the more likely to be a content provider and to be attributor, and therefore theoretically may more likely to be affected by GDPR. Our sample is 1,000 websites, and it's approximately 50-50 between EU and US. We start our data collection a few months before the GDPR implementations in order to compare before and after this implementation, and we keep collecting data. And we visit domains in a wave, periodically in wave, because for technical reasons, we cannot visit each domain each days of the year. So we use wave. Those wave, it's a 6 day of interval. And during this 6 day of interval, we mine data from both EU and US location, meaning we simulate to be a EU consumer or an US consumer, and we browse on this website. And we complement those data that we collect using different IP with external sources such as GDELT, Alexa, or Facebook. Our final sample have both technical and downstream economic variable, so content quality and content quantity. So some example of the technical variable. So we collect first party and third party cookie. For example, we collect all the HTTP requests. We collect the length of the advertising on the home page using different, we ID those cookies or advertising requests using filters from AdBlock Plus, for example. And we also collect the consent mechanism on the websites to see how the website has implemented and take into consideration this new set of rules. We also collect, like I said, downstream economic variable that we collect from external sources. So for example, we collect the new amounts, the new URL domains posts during those waves. So we use GDEL for that. We also have content quality that we proxy by user engagement. So we have data from Alexa. So for example, reach per million or page view per visitor, or the number of Facebook share or like on each URL that we collect with GDELT. So some descriptive evidence, I will present you some descriptive evidence on the technical variable. So for example, here this graph depicts the share of consent mechanism based on different IP. So for example, here the orange lines show you the number of websites that have implemented a consent mechanism when we browse it with a European IP. What we could underline here on this graph is this green line that show the percentage of consent mechanism with a UIP on US domain that is lower than the other. This could be explained by the fact that some of websites like the Washington Post decide to block a EU visitor or stop tracking EU visitor after the implementation of GDPR. Therefore, they don't need to have a consent mechanism if they block EU user or stop tracking them. We also have a very interesting effect here on the number of tracking cookie. So for example, the blue line, it's the number of tracking cookie on the US IP when we browse this website or this domain with a US IP. And we can see that after GDPR implementation, this number of tracking increase for US domain with a US IP, whereas it decreases dramatically for US domain on UIP, meaning that there is a big distinction between EU user and US user on a US website. This distinction between EU user and US user is less important for European domains. That's allied the fact that the GDPR has been implemented in a different way by US website and European website. On our downstream variable effects, we can see that the number of new URL seems to decrease after the GDPR, but in the same magnitude for both US domain and EU domains. However, for the number of page view per visitor for EU and US domain, we can see that the red line, so the UE domains receive less page view per visitor after the implementation of the GDPR, with this decrease here. So, like I say, we use a naive diff. So basically, our variable of interest that we estimate with EU domain after the GDPR, and we use a wave and domain fixed effect in our empirical analysis. Our results show that there is no significant results for the number of new URL. However, we can see that there is a decrease in number of page view per visitor for EU domain compared to US domains. So, as I say, it's still ongoing work. So we're still collecting data in order to improve our paper, in particular with consent mechanism that we try to take in a further step. And we consider using other model that should allow us to respond to the fact that the naive diff approach is far from perfect, and because we don't know what is control and what is not. As we see, US domain responds to GDPR in a different way, and a different way from a European website or European domain. Therefore, we cannot say that just comparing EU domain and US domain is perfect, because we are not sure that what is control and what is treatments, and we want to try what is the meaning of GDPR compliance and when it starts for websites, in order to be sure that we capture the full image, the full impact of GDPR on a content provider. Fortunately for us, we can use our technical variable to see how websites respond to GDPR. So, in order to conclude this presentation, we can underline the fact that we see some effects of GDPR. Our results indicate an initial decrease in tracking in both EU and US domain for UN IP visitor, followed by an increase, particularly for US IP visitors. So we can see a clear distinction between US IP and European IP. And we don't seem to have to see an impact of EU domain on reach, even a slightly increase, but we see a decrease in page view per visitor. So in a nutshell, GDPR enactment does not seem to have negatively affect the amount of content that EU domain were able to publish compared to US domain, or the degree of content engagement. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just trying to turn my timer off. Okay. So we have a question from Yo. Is the time span shown before introduction of GDPR long enough to really appreciate the trends?
So thank you for this question. So we believe that for technical variable, we have, even if it's a little bit short, maybe it's quite enough, because the other paper on GDPR show that the decrease of, for example, the number of tracker or this kind of stuff appears just after the implementation of the GDPR. And for our main dependent variable, meaning the user engagements or the content quantity, we collect data 2 years before the implementation of GDPR. So we will just use this short amount of time just before the GDPR for technical variable.
Okay, we have another question from Rainer. Is it a decrease of tracking or a decrease of observable tracking indicators?
So of observable, really great question. So it's a decrease of observable tracking. Yeah, indeed.
Okay. And from Stephen Bonner, says, you mentioned you have a database of technical data that shows compliance with GDPR. Could you talk a little bit more about that capability or provide a link?
Sorry?
Stephen Bonner asks, you mentioned that you have a database of technical data that shows compliance with GDPR. Could you talk a little more about that or provide a link?
Yeah, so for example, what we have in mind is our technical variable. And so, for example, we want to see if the website stopped to track users. We also want to investigate a little bit more with consent mechanism. So I just present you a graph with the share of consent mechanism, but we want to use it to see what is happening when a website decides to implement this kind of enforcement of the GDPR, and we also want to use several of this technical variable to see if the website is compliant or not.
Wendy Grossman asks, did you develop any sense of how widespread US blocking of EU domains is? Numerous local papers still claim that EU visitors are very important to us, but still blocking entirely.
So from the top of my head, I believe we have 80% of US websites that block your visitors. And we investigate that, of course, about the amount of US blocking of US website blocking EU visitors.
Right. And Shirin asks, so how do you distinguish between EU and US websites? Is it the IP address, the domain extension, or something else such as the head office location?
So in the paper, we want to use several distinctions, but in these presentations, we use the number of visitors that browse on the websites. So if the large majority of visitors is from US, we say that is a US domains. But we want to use the headquarter and more other aspects on this regard.
So what we will do now is move across to the discussion phase. We have quite a few questions about the crime is boring paper. So I'll give Ben a few minutes first of all to have a bit of a chat and respond to those questions before we have a more general discussion. Please keep asking questions in the chat. Perhaps put the name of the person that you're asking the question of at the start, so we know who's to respond. And if we can't get your question in this discussion, perhaps they can also respond to you offline. So Ben, do you want to have a quick kind of response to the questions that have been asked about the crime is boring paper?
Yeah, sure. And thanks very much for everyone for your questions. Like, they're all really interesting and really useful, and hopefully develop this work further. To start with, just quickly on, I'll try and go through them as quickly as I can. So for Stephen's question, yes, absolutely, the attacker versus the defender thing is really interesting. And it's interesting, I think, as well, to think about what, like, you know, the defensive side of security is also a subculture. It's got values, people have these visions of themselves, it's got systems of social status, it's got all these things. And potentially, if people are burning out, obviously, the one answer there is unionization, but also potentially maybe there's some sort of a part of it is this conflict between the kind of self-image and the reality of the work. And I think one of the really interesting subcultures that I've seen is that these kind of like sysadmin subcultures where people do system administration work for a long period of time. And sysadmin work is incredibly valuable. It's enormously important work. It's like crucial to most big infrastructure actually functioning. And so, and some, maybe perhaps what we need to do is look at some of these sysadmin subcultures and sort of like, yeah, reimagine what the norms and visions of cybersecurity might look like a bit. to the question on, are there boring cybercrime activities you wouldn't classify as infrastructure work? Yes, so the answer to this is probably actually exploit development in some ways. So some of that stuff is really interesting, a lot of that kind of theoretical, technical stuff where people are coming up with whole new classes of things and breaking stuff in interesting ways, but a lot of that work is actually also pretty boring in itself. No offense to anyone on the call. Like, a lot of it's really sort of like, you know, scrolling through your APIs, blasting through it, trying to find like the little bugs and stuff. And a lot of it takes like really repetitive, long form, hard work. It's not all sort of like flash in the pan creativity and vision. In terms of AI tools, I think that's a really good point. And I think some people have managed to automate this in interesting ways. But the problem is that for most of these businesses, the skills for these people they're getting to do the server management are way too low to do this or even to use these sort of tools. And even where they have managed to implement these kinds of things, you often essentially need someone to babysit the chatbot, to babysit the kind of the tool itself. So you still require someone to do that kind of boring work. In terms of the research process and our confidence in the results, this is a really good question. It's something that we don't cover too much in the presentation. So the kind of approach to this was, we had a sort of core set of interviews. It was actually really surprising how willing people were to talk to us. So we hung out on some chat channels and stuff and interviewed quite a few people. But obviously, you're kind of interested in how representative a selection that is. So we used this, and we kind of throughout this bounced back and forward between kind of interviews and then going on looking through the kind of big data analysis, looking through the social data. And we used the findings of these interviews to kind of drive this sort of social data analysis and see if we can find more evidence for these sort of trends, these sorts of experiences. In terms of the low skill, high impact question, yes, this is absolutely correct. And I think something I may have misspoke a bit on in the paper. So yeah, absolutely. A lot of this activity is low skill and volume, but very high impact. A good example of this is the kind of like, especially where it goes into like kind of harassment, stalking, spy tech as a service, this kind of stuff. And I think the crucial thing here is actually the scale, especially for enforcement. So centralized law enforcement agencies like the FBI or the NCA are really, really good at solving crime problems that are to do with like small cells of people, like small numbers of people. They're really good at arresting. Like if a crime problem's 100 people in the world, they're quite good at breaking that up. What they're not good at is solving problems that are caused by tens of thousands of 17-year-olds buying infrastructural services. That is a much harder problem for them to crack with their tools. So I think they'd be very happy to try and scale this stuff back down. Finally, I do agree that kind of not everyone gets into this expecting sort of Lamborghinis and gold watches and stuff. But I think what's interesting here is part of one of the things that I believe quite strongly in is not blocking people's escape routes from this stuff. So when people get involved in this stuff, it's often because they have blocked opportunities in kind of mainstream society or kind of aren't able to kind of, because it's similar sorts of work as you point out. But when you kind of crack down on people, where you do these mass arrests, where you make people's lives a lot harder, that also blocks these escape routes for them back into mainstream society from this kind of work. And I guess part of the paper is that these kind of like, for the kind of what's the takeaway, like these sort of pre-made desistance paths exist in these infrastructural economies, this kind of burnout model of desistance, and to kind of not block that, I guess. I think that's kind of run through everything. Apologies if I've missed anything there.
Okay, so if anyone has any further questions, they can contact Ben or put them in the chat. So Jim Graves asks, Qasim, is there any rational reason for a network not to use source address validation apart from those you list? For example, the added complexity and the risk that it might accidentally block legitimate traffic is seen as a bigger problem than the occasional risk of a denial of service attack, or that DDoS is a problem that's solved for big sites only by content distribution networks?
So yeah, there are definitely some reasons or technical reasons where they cannot deploy source address validation, and one of them is these are like a transit ASs, or if they are in a peering relationship where they have another customer AS and then they need to route the traffic through their network. In those cases, they would not exactly know, or it will be very difficult for them to know if the traffic coming towards their network is spoofed or not. In our paper, though, we looked specifically at the internet service providers, and I don't have the exact number, but large majority of them were stub ASs. That means that the problem of transit ASs was not there. But in any case, even in the stub AS, they could be multi-homed. So that means that they have two providers, and in some cases, they could have routing relationships where they need to route traffic through their network. And it might be technically hard for them to deploy source address validation or in a stricter mode where they can block all the spoof traffic going through their network. So there is definitely some issues with the technical side, but like because we looked at the ISPs, and this was one of the reasons to not to take everything from spoofer or the open resolver dataset, but just to look at the ISP dataset, so we could minimize this impact of technical issues where they actually need to have, or they could not actually do source address validation within their network.
Okay. Now, Daniel Thomas asks, would advertising non-compliant networks to cybercriminals help pressure them to comply, as they'll get a lot of people paying with stolen credit cards?
Yeah, it's a really good, interesting point. And so the thing is that there was a paper before us by Matthew Lucky from CADA. They sent notifications to the network operators, telling them they're not compliant. And one of the mechanism was to also put the non-compliant networks on the network operator group list, so not different NOCs. And that is a private, or that is a public mailing list, right? So they looked up whether people were getting more compliant using the private notifications, or if they are just gonna post it on public mailing list, would that have any impact? And what they found was that actually publicly naming or shaming in a way, they were not shaming per se, because if you look at their mail, they are just saying like, hey, we found AS this to be non-compliant. And when you click on the link, it gives you anonymized /24 IP address where they received a result of the network being allowing IP spoofing. So what they found was like it is equally effective, if not more, to actually push these on mailing lists, and that's what they've been doing ever since. And in our now follow-up study, we are using NOC list for not only the spoofer but also for open resolver. So we are working with CADA on the upcoming paper. And we are also looking at if we send these notifications to certs and then asking certs to notify on our behalf to see if there is some kind of element of using these multiple channels has any impact of they getting compliant. So that's hopefully our next paper and something which we are looking into.
Okay. Now, Stephen Bonner asks, there seems to be a movement on BGP RPKI through giving transparency to customers and having them put pressure on the ISP to fix. Could something similar work for source address validation?
Yes, exactly. A really good point. Again, we did mention in our paper, I think the website is BGP Safe. You could also publicly post, and this is one of the conclusions we also had, like if you can publicly post on Twitter or social media the results of your test, which Spoofer doesn't, or Spoofer tool doesn't have the ability as of now, or they don't give the users the ability to post the results. And also RPKI to me is a really interesting point, because it's also like it doesn't solve a huge issue, but it's still something which is a good practice, right? And there is a huge community push behind RPKI. Like I see more and more papers coming out on RPKI. I see more and more discussions on network operating groups, in RIPE, all the RIRs meetings. You could see a huge push. And even like, as I said, the experiment we are running, we got a reply from one of the operators saying like, hey, we know we are non-compliant, but our primary focus right now is to have RPKI deployed in our network. So for some reason, RPKI has really pushed, as far as I understand this year or a year before now, like the push is there from the community but I don't see, honestly, the same kind of push for BCP38 or source address validation as of now.
Thank you. Now, the next question is, I'll direct that back to Vincent. So Himanshu was interested in this, the database of GDPR compliance, and asks if it's openly available. Vincent, are you able to respond to that?
Hey, Alice, I'm not sure what happened to this. Oh, Vincent, you're in?
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, I turn off my microphone and can
Oh.
turn it on back. So for the moment, no, the database is not openly available because we're still collecting them. But I need to speak with my co-author and so on. But I will be open to put it online in the future. I don't know if it will be close or far future, but I'm open to put it online if my co-author agree, of course.
Okay, so you're open to people contacting you about that to find out when
Sure.
when it's available. Okay. So Richard points out that it will be moved to a random chat for a coffee break soon, and that you should be able to enable video microphones, and those who are on the WEIS committee there'll be a meeting in room 14. So thank you very much for a brilliant session, and I look forward to chatting to you in the coffee break.
Thanks, Alice, for awesome chairing as well.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.